Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Cliff May of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies about the growing axis of authoritarians around the world, Israel's escalating campaign against Iran and its proxies, and whether the U.S. is able and willing to fight a two-front war if necessary. And then we dive into the stark differences between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris over the Ukraine-Russia war and the latest developments from this week's meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I am your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor. Here at the Times, a really fascinating and in-depth interview with Cliff May of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Coming up later in the show, we'll touch on hotspots all around the world with Cliff. But before we get to that, first things first, as always, Guy, what's on your radar this week?
It's great to be here on the podcast for another week, Ben. Off the top, as we've been taping this week's episode, the Israeli government has claimed to have DNA evidence confirming that Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas and the architect of the Palestinian militant group's October 7, 2023 terrorist rampage into Israel, was killed in an Israeli military raid in the Gaza Strip. If Yahya Sinwar is indeed dead, it would be the latest triumph for Israel in hunting down those behind the October 7 massacre. Ismail Haniyeh, long the political leader of Hamas, was killed by a bomb while in Tehran this past summer. Now, Sinwar's possible death could prove yet another hurdle for the U.S.-backed diplomatic efforts to negotiate a ceasefire in Gaza. One that might free dozens of Israeli and foreign nationals held by Hamas since October 7th. But it could also open the way for that ceasefire. Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz said Thursday that Sinwar's death could improve the chances of an end to the Gaza fighting. We'll be tracking it at Threat Status. Right now, it's not clear what impact this all could have on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. I want to point out that while the U.S. began deploying a THAAD anti-missile system to Israel to help stave off any future attack on Israel by Iran, tensions are running pretty high between the Biden administration and the Netanyahu government over the humanitarian situation. The White House made headlines at the start of this past week by claiming the Israelis aren't allowing U.S. aid into Gaza and announcing that the U.S. is now giving Israel 30 days to improve the situation or face an arms embargo. We'll also be tracking this aspect of the conflict. On a separate front, Ben, my attention has been on Pakistan, which has spent recent days hosting a major summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's the geopolitical grouping founded in 2001 by China and Russia to counter Western alliances. A slew of foreign minister-level diplomats attended the summit, including India's foreign minister, who made a rare visit to Islamabad. Remember, India, despite being the world's largest democracy and a close partner of the United States, presents itself globally as a neutral power. Delhi has close, albeit tense, relations with Russia. It generally has more tense relations with Beijing. Anyway, the key development at the summit was that Russia and China announced that they intend to further boost cooperation with each other heading into 2025. This is a trend and a partnership that finds China supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine, among other things. We're going to dive a little deeper into the dynamic later in the podcast here when Cliff May joins us from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. One important development on Ukraine, by the way, Ben, was the claim by Ukrainian intelligence in recent days that North Korea now has 10,000 infantry soldiers undergoing training in Russia's Far East in preparation for deployment to border areas near Ukraine. Remember, Western intelligence has said North Korea is providing weaponry to Russian forces inside Ukraine. And there were reports a couple of weeks ago that at least 2 North Korean officers were killed in Ukraine while supporting the Russian side. So we're tracking that as well. A major North Korean deployment of troops into Ukraine could dramatically shift the entire geopolitical picture around the now 3-year-old war.
You know, and it reminds me too, we had Guillaume Patak on the program last week, our Washington Times correspondent in Ukraine, and he talked, at length and had some interesting things to say about how Russia's pulling forces, from other parts of, both inside Russia and outside Russia, foreigners, now including North Koreans. So it does kind of challenge this narrative that Russia is just willing to send endless waves of its own people into the fight. It is to some degree, but it's also looking to pull folks from other places, apparently, including North Korea as well. While we're on the subject of Ukraine, Guy, we are now less than 3 weeks away from the U.S. presidential election here between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And from where we sit here at Threat Status, we're especially interested in where these two candidates come down on the Ukraine-Russia war. I had a deep dive on that this week in the Washington Times, where I examined the differences between the two. Harris with a more calculated, somewhat boring approach, stay the course, staying with Ukraine, but no real clarity on how this ends. And Trump with his, trademark bombastic outside the box style, vowing to end the war immediately and suggesting he'll use America's leverage to force Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelenskyy to the negotiating table. Ironically, friend of the show, Michael O'Hanlon of the Brookings Institution, told me that he thinks a combination of those two is probably what we actually need to break the logjam of the war and maybe move toward peace. But that, I think, is where Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the president of Ukraine, comes into the picture. He just this week unveiled a long-awaited, quote, victory plan, unquote, which a lot of observers, including in the U.S., thought or hoped might actually be the first step toward a real ceasefire, a negotiated end to the war.
Did you really read the proposal, Ben? What did you think of it?
I did. I read the speech that he gave to the Ukrainian parliament. And to be honest, it reminded me of the speeches he's given to the UN General Assembly, other public addresses that he's given, outlining this 5-point plan. And even some folks in the Ukrainian parliament referred to it as a wish list. And that's frankly how I saw it as well. It does seem to be sort of this dream world that Zelenskyy has, that if the West does, X, Y, and Z in this list of things, he thinks that will eventually result in victory for Ukraine. But it doesn't really spell out anything about peace negotiations or realistic expectations for where things go from here. So that was my take. And look, I don't think I was alone. I don't know what you thought of it, Guy, but the proposal was mostly, from what I've seen, panned across a lot of the U.S. and Europe. The State Department said only that they're engaging with Ukraine about it. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte sounded skeptical, even more skeptical than that. He said, quote, "We are working with the Ukrainians to understand better how this would help in ending the war," unquote. So what does all this mean? In the context of the U.S. presidential election, one of my big takeaways from it, Guy, is I think we can say with virtual certainty now that Zelenskyy is not going to go willingly to the negotiating table to end this war. And hey, maybe that's the right thing to do as a matter of principle, the morally right thing to do. His country was invaded after all, and his civilians are the ones who've been attacked by Russian troops for 2.5 years. But all serious observers of this war know, and we've said ad nauseum here in the podcast over and over, that this war is going to end with negotiations at some point, whether that's now, a year from now, or later than that. No one thinks Ukraine or Russia is going to score a completely decisive win on the battlefield.
Like a stalemate.
Essentially, yes.
I mean, I got into this with Peter Bergen in the Threat Status Influencers video that comes out. It's just come out as this podcast is coming out, and I encourage people to go listen. It's actually watch. It's a sit-down video interview, and he talks about that aspect that like the United States can do this, the others in world powers can do that, but this really comes down to the Ukrainians and the Russians at this point.
It does. And I think it's clear now that Zelenskyy just isn't going to reach the negotiation stage without a serious push from the West, led by the U.S. It's clear that'll happen if Trump wins on November 5th. And if Harris wins, it's less clear what happens. And that, I think, potentially might be a recipe for disaster if we muddle through 2025 with open-ended U.S. military aid, but no clear plan.
I don't know if it's more or less clear vis-a-vis Harris or Trump. because the claims that Trump makes, that he'll end the war before he takes the oath of office, which, by the way, would be a violation of the Logan Act, which precludes him from negotiating with foreign powers if he's not actually president yet. Bergen makes this point in our interview, but his claims are not necessarily more clarified than her own very vague posture of this kind of, we'll keep supporting them as long as it takes. So I think, it's nuanced to try and figure out where they're obviously totally different in their approach, but in terms of, it's very hard to predict. And the reason it's hard to predict is because the Ukrainians and the Russians are the ones that have lost so much fighting against each other. And just erasing those losses by jumping into a negotiation is a very hard thing to do, I think.
I mean, I think what is clear, at least, best as we can tell, is that Trump probably at some point relatively early on in a theoretical Trump administration would probably dangle U.S. aid to some degree, sort of a carrot and stick approach that you go to the negotiating table. We're not going to keep providing you arms and military aid, another $60 billion of aid indefinitely. Whereas Harris, maybe she would. I don't know. Maybe she wouldn't. I think that's unclear. I think she's been intentionally vague. I think there's a reason why we don't have a lot of the clarity from her position. So, it remains to be seen. I do think this might have been a missed opportunity for Zelenskyy, and one that actually, over the long term, depending on how things play out on the ground, could actually hurt, not help, his effort to get more military backing from the U.S. Because if he shows what some critics would interpret as a stubbornness to go to the ceasefire negotiating table with Russia, I'm not sure that necessarily helps his cause.
Not to mention that, and I think we talked about this with Guillaume last week, he's got nationalists around him that he has to accommodate and appease in order to stay in power himself. So he's facing his own delicate domestic political situation. We seem to be some of the only people who really want to talk about that. I don't see much mention of it in the mainstream media, but we have discussed it with some people who are looking at what is going on with Zelenskyy, how long he'll be in power, how we are in a ongoing imposition of martial law, essentially. So this is a complicated. It's a war. It's messy, and my hope is that the end of the killing comes. Cliff May, the renowned American journalist, editor, political activist. He's the founder and president of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a think tank created more than 20 years ago in Washington. He also hosts his own podcast there. It is called Foreign Policy. And perhaps most importantly, Cliff is a regular opinion contributor to the Washington Times and Threat Status on national security issues. Cliff, thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure to see you.
Same here. Let me ask you about your most recent column. The title was "Year After Hamas Attacked Israel, Anti-Zionists Cry Out for More Massacres." Essentially, you argue that many people in the U.S., including some prominent lawmakers, are spouting pro-Hamas propaganda in criticism of Israel and not being honest about what Hamas and Hezbollah really are, Iran-backed terrorist organizations. Is that right? And what were you really saying here?
Quite right, Guy. As you know, October 7th, 2023, Hamas terrorists invaded Israel and carried out a pogrom, the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. It included tying parents to babies and burning them alive, decapitations, mass rapes, mass murders of civilians, just horrendous. And then, by the way, on October 8th, Hezbollah up in Lebanon began firing missiles at the north of Israel and has done so pretty much every day over the course of the year. So Israel was immediately fighting a two-front war, but there were other fronts as well. In the West Bank, the Houthis of Yemen shooting missiles at Israel, various Shia militias in Syria and in Iraq. And so we had this one-year sort of anniversary last week, and I was kind of eager to watch how people would respond to it. And what I say in my column in the Washington Times is that decent people mourned the 1,200 people that were killed on that terrible day a year ago, and that they mourned those who have died in the war since. That's what the decent people did last week. I also noticed, though, and this was really what the column was about, that there were plenty of indecent people. And the indecent people are the anti-Zionists, who not only justified the pogrom, the killing of civilians, the terrible devastation that has come to Gaza, and it's come to Gaza because of Hamas. Hamas brought this war on. This was not how Gaza was living a year and a month ago. It's not how Gazans were living a year and a month ago. But this is what Hamas decided to start this war. And yet the anti-Zionists, the indecent people, they want more killing. They want more Israelis killed. They want this war to continue, and they want it. And it's not like you can say, well, let's have, plenty of people do, a diplomatic solution. Let's have a good outcome, a win-win outcome. Because what the anti-Zionists want, and most of them are pretty open about this, they want the extermination of Israel. Now, how do you exterminate Israel without exterminating Israelis? Well, some say you don't. And that's what's necessary, the extermination of Israelis.
But Cliff, terminologies are important. You use the term anti-Zionist, and you've defined it a very specific way right now. I guess I'm seeing this, I'm trying to put my finger on the pulse of a very sensitive debate here, right? And my question for you is anti-Zionist the same as anti-Semitic, really? And is that a new thing? Is it possible to be critical of Israel without being anti-Semitic? And if so, how is that possible?
So to be a Zionist nowadays means nothing more than you believe Israel should continue to exist. You think it has a right to exist, and it should continue to exist. That's what being a Zionist means nowadays, nothing else. To be an anti-Zionist means what? It means you don't believe Israel should exist. If you don't believe it should exist, then again, I ask you, by what mechanism do you seek to disestablish Israel? Would you say that, for example, you want, as many do, the war to continue until you see again what happened on 10/7 happen in every city in Israel, until the Israelis are all killed or all driven out somewhere? You think they can all get on boats and move to Brooklyn and Boca Raton, or go to Berlin, or go to Warsaw? Or do you think that the way the Israeli state ends is the Israeli government gives full citizenship to everybody in Gaza, full citizenship to everybody in the West Bank, and then says, let Hamas form a political party and it can run for office, and then we'll see what happens? Is that what you think? Is that really what you think? Because if not, if you're an anti-Zionist, again, what do you mean by the disestablishment of Israel? By what mechanism does that happen?
Very good questions. We could spend the entire time digging into this debate, but I think we're just enlightening our audience a little bit on how deep that goes. I want to bring Ben into the conversation.
Yeah, Cliff, thanks so much. It's Ben Wolfgang. Thank you for joining us here in the show. We'll get back to Israel a little bit later, but speaking of your columns at the Washington Times, you write a lot about the axis of authoritarians, or the axis of tyranny, and we talk about it a lot here in the show, and rightfully so. I'm curious if you see the axis of authoritarians, typically defined China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Do you see that axis as sort of a living, breathing thing that could potentially grow and pull other members into it over the next 5-10 years, or even longer? We've had some folks on the show suggest that Venezuela should be included in that now, based on especially what we've seen over the past few months. Do you view that as basically a living thing that you think could suck other countries in? And if so, which countries are at risk of being sucked in?
It's already happening, is the first thing I'd say. And let me just give a fragment of history. When FDD was created, just after the attacks of 9/11, we were created with the idea that, hey, America does have enemies. And we thought of them as terrorists. We thought of them as jihadists. That was a new word 23 years ago for most Americans. We thought of them as Islamists. By the way, we didn't think that Russia was going to be an enemy. At that point, George W. Bush met with Putin, looked into his eyes, said, I got a glimpse of his soul, not a bad guy, we can do business. I think the general view was Russia will be a liberal democracy of some sort, not Jeffersonian, but it'll come around. As for China, keep in mind, again, in 2001, we gave the People's Republic of China most favored nation status. It was a communist country, but we thought not really. In 2001, the U.S., brought the People's Republic of China into the World Trade Organization. The prevailing theory on the right and on the left was China is going to be a partner, a strategic partner, a good stakeholder in the liberal, America-led, rules-based world order, because we're going to help make them rich. And if they become rich, they'll become moderate. Didn't work out that way, did it? Not at all. So now you have this axis that has been forming. And you're right, I wrote about it a couple of years ago as I saw it begin to form for the Washington Times, along with a guy who happens to be the world expert on the history of tyrannies, called it the Axis of Tyrannies, but now we're more likely calling it the Axis of Aggressors, others the Axis of Authoritarians, the Axis of Anti-Americans, of Autocrats, of Revanchists, a lot of names. It's an axis. And at the center of the axis is what? Is Beijing. And we now know very clearly that Xi Jinping wants to displace the United States as the preeminent world power and replace the current world order that is American-led with one that is Beijing-led. Now, Xi Jinping has made common cause with Vladimir Putin. They have a partnership that has, quote unquote, according to them, no limits. And now Tehran and the Islamist Republic of Iran is very much in this partnership, economically, but also militarily. Russia and Iran are trading weapons. Iran is making drones and missiles to help kill people in Ukraine. So those three are very much, but guess what? North Korea is very much part of this axis too. Relations between Russia and North Korea have never been closer, with North Korea supplying munitions to Russia to use in Ukraine and reportedly sending troops, North Korean troops that are going to help fight in Ukraine as well. And North Korea, as you know, has nuclear weapons and increasingly sophisticated missiles to deliver them. And yes, this axis is also now including Caracas, Venezuela, very close relations with Russia, with China, with Tehran, and Havana. And through things such as various organizations, the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, BRICS, China is intending to, in various ways, expand its influence in the world. China, I would argue at this point, is more influential at the United Nations than the United States is. They've kind of taken that over to a great extent. So yes, you have this axis, and I'm going to go further, Ben, and say, and I'm not the first to say this, I'll give credit where credit's due. This axis is waging a Cold War against the United States, Cold War 2.0. The historian Neil Ferguson recognized this as early as about 2018. And the U.S. and too many of its allies don't recognize that a Cold War is being waged. There is a Cold War being waged. We cannot win it if we do not recognize it is being waged against us.
Cliff, if the Cold War becomes a hot war, one of the things that I'm most interested in is whether the U.S. right now, today, as we sit here in October 2024, is capable of fighting and winning a two-front war. If, God forbid, it comes to that, which none of us want to see, of course. But, whether it's in Europe and the Pacific or in the Pacific and the Middle East, some combination of theaters, a real legitimate multi-domain war that draws the U.S. in. Do you get to say, do we have the money, the manpower, the assets, and probably most importantly, the stomach for that right now as a country?
That's exactly right. You need two things. You need capabilities and you need will, determination. We're very lacking in will, and our capabilities, though still very strong, are diminishing. Our defense budget has been diminishing every year of the Biden administration. It was increased somewhat, not enough, I would say, during the Trump administration. The percentage we spend on defense of GDP is much lower now than it was during the first Cold War. And Cold War 2.0 is a much more challenging Cold War because the Soviet Union was never the power that the People's Republic of China is. That's the most powerful communist regime in history. And again, it has allies in Moscow, in Tehran, and other places. So we're not doing what we need to do. The Chinese Navy is already bigger than ours, growing fast, and ours is diminishing at the same time. And as for will, look at the Houthis of Yemen. This is a terrorist group backed by Iran. Instead of shooting the archers, we've been shooting the arrows. We can't deter or defeat the Houthis with the American military. Now, I would argue it's not a matter of capabilities. It's a matter of will. We haven't been willing to do it. You can do it by going after them hard, but you can also do it a very simple way. You say to the people who are supplying the Houthis with their weapons, with their missiles, those are Iran's brutal rulers. You say to them, you will stop supplying them with missiles. You will stop immediately. If you do not, we will hurt you. And we'll hurt you very badly. You have a Navy, you may not have one next week. You have nuclear facilities that you're working on to produce bombs. We've been saying for years, presidents of both parties, we won't let you develop nuclear weapons. In 2 days, we can take out all your nuclear facilities. We will do so as we promised. So you will do what we tell you to do, and you will stop hitting commercial ships and our vessels in the Red Sea immediately. By the way, we know there is an Iranian intelligence vessel right there in the Red Sea that is providing intelligence to the Houthis so they know who to strike. Why is that vessel not at the bottom of the Red Sea right now?
Let's stay back in the Middle East, specifically, obviously, Arab powers as well as Turkey are aware of this axis that you're describing. And if it exists to the extent that I know you believe that it does, these Arab powers are making careful calculations toward it, as well as toward the current war between Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah, two very different Iran-backed proxies, even though they've aligned and collaborated with each other. My question is, as Israel is ramping up this new phase of its military campaign, focusing on Hezbollah to the north and possibly directly toward Iran, how likely are regional dynamics to shift, with Arab powers, specifically the Saudis, potentially viewing that campaign as within their own interests?
Absolutely. I've been to Saudi Arabia any number of times. The Saudis very much want to see that the Israelis are reliable and good partners against common enemies. And the main common enemy of Israel and Saudi Arabia is the regime in Tehran. So when don't forget, Tehran likes to use Arabs as pawns. Hamas, those are Arabs, they're Sunnis, they're pawns. Hezbollah, those are Shia, but they're Arabs, they're pawns. The Houthis, Shia, Arabs, pawns. Iran generally doesn't like to fight with its own people, but it may have to, and it started to. It's attacked Israel twice now with hundreds of ballistic missiles. I do think Israel will have to respond to that before too very long in a fairly robust fashion. The Saudis are willing, and others have under the Abraham Accords, made peace with Israel. Not so much because they think, wouldn't it be nice if we can go to Tel Aviv and have hummus on Saturday night? That's really not what it's about. What they want to know is they have a partner who can't leave the region and who will stand up to their common enemy. If they don't think that's true, they will have to hedge their bets and find some modus vivendi, some arrangement with Iran, if it becomes, as it intends to, this regime in Iran, the hegemon, the boss of the Middle East, and the imperialist and colonialist. Why? As you know, Hezbollah, which is the Foreign Legion of the Islamic Republic of Iran, controls Lebanon, and it's eaten away at Lebanon, making it into a failed state, dragging it into a war. Lebanon is about $200 billion in debt. Used to be a great place, Lebanon. Hezbollah has ruined it. Hezbollah also has backed Assad in Syria and helped Assad, as the Russians have, again, part of this axis, to kill literally millions of Syrians, mostly Sunni Arabs. Again, in Yemen, that's also a proxy. So Yemen is also a sort of colony of Iran. The Islamic Republic of Iran, when they say they want to spread their revolution, they mean they want to spread their Islamic empire and be the leader of an empire of Muslims that fights America and the free world.
So let's close it out with this, Cliff. I want to know, how are things going to look in 2025? And then, has FDD endorsed a candidate? Are you staunchly in either the Trump camp or the Harris camp?
We're totally nonpartisan. We're about policy, not politics. We will try with whoever is in the White House to get the United States to have sensible policies that protect the national interest. And we're at a time that I think we are, again, endangered in a way we haven't been for a long time and not recognizing that fact. I think as we record this, there are changes happening in the Middle East that are important. The reported death of the last and most important Hamas leader, Yahya Sinwar. It appears that he's been killed in Gaza. If so, there's no longer an important Hamas leader in Gaza. The most important Hamas leader is in Qatar. He should be immediately told to surrender, to release the hostages, and if not, he should be extradited to America for the killing of Americans by Hamas, or to Israel, where they would put him on trial. Meanwhile, Nasrallah, who has been for several decades the head of Hezbollah, he has also been eliminated. So the landscape is changing very rapidly in the Middle East. Bad things could still happen and probably will. But we're seeing some important changes there.
Cliff May from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a columnist at the Washington Times, a contributor to Threat Status. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Cliff.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Guy.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here domestically at home or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now this week as you are listening to the show. Guy, my threat of the week is drones. And we've talked on this show a lot about drones, including just last week when we talked at length with Guillaume about the role of drones in the Russia-Ukraine war. They, of course, have been a part of conflicts all across the Middle East. The Houthis and their patron state, Iran, have used drones to attack Israel. ISIS used drones last decade. We use drones all the time. The U.S., of course. We used one to kill al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri in Kabul in July 2022. So drones are a part of war. We all know that and accept it. But smaller drones, and sometimes ones of unknown origin, unknown purpose, are actually a threat here at home. Our colleague Mike Glenn had a story this week about how Langley Air Force Base officials are in the market for a special anti-drone net to shield U.S. aircraft such as F-22 stealth fighters from drones flying overhead. Listeners may remember that a year or so ago, at least a dozen drones flew over the airfield at Langley. Mysterious of origin, still not sure where they were from. And earlier this month, a Chinese national was sentenced to 6 months in prison for taking drone footage at a shipbuilding site in Virginia. So this isn't just a problem at military bases. The TSA says that since 2021, there have been over 2,000 drone sightings near U.S. airports, including incidents at major airports almost every day. From 2021 through 2022 alone, TSA said that 63 drone incidents caused pilots to take evasive action, including 4 that involved commercial aircraft that you and I could be flying on at any given time. A vast majority of these probably aren't harmful from a national security sense, right? Not flown by our enemies. But the FAA estimates there's going to be nearly 1 million business, research, and educational drones in the U.S. by 2027. And the number of personal drones flown by private individuals as a hobby or just for fun is going to be nearly 2 million by 2027. So this is a massive issue, Guy, and it's one that's increasing exponentially, literally almost every single day. And right now it's my threat of the week because the federal government, while they know it's a problem and some steps are certainly being taken to address it, when you look at those raw numbers, so far I'm not convinced that we have a plan to necessarily deal with an issue that's escalating so quickly.
Totally. I also don't, it's not a new phenomenon. This discussion has been going on for like the last 10 years. It's totally interesting. Thanks for pointing that out as your threat of the week, Ben. My threat of the week is that of suddenly escalating tensions between North and South Korea. The U.S. has nearly 30,000 military personnel stationed in South Korea. In the past week or so, has seen tensions with the North soaring to a level we haven't seen in years, probably since the beginning of the first Trump presidency in 2017, when Pyongyang carried out its last nuclear test. While we can speculate that North Korea may currently be seizing on the moment and ramping up provocations ahead of the November 5 U.S. presidential election, the reality is that the North is taking out its fury toward South Korea. North Korea put its border artillery units on standby in recent days after claiming South Korea has conducted drone operations in the night skies over Pyongyang. Then the most recent development saw North Korea suddenly use explosives to blow apart 2 key road crossing points at opposite ends of the demilitarized zone dividing North and South Korea. None of the DMZ road or rail crossings have been transited for years, but they have been left in place by both governments on the hope that diplomacy might open between Seoul and Pyongyang. Now that hope appears to be evaporating before our eyes.
Yeah, it's a concerning situation, that's for sure. Thank you for that, Guy, and thank you all for listening. A huge thanks to Cliff May from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies for joining us on this week's episode. Please go ahead, do hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and we will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.